Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we're back with more. A Testament of Hope, the writings and speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today we'll be picking up where we last left off with his Playboy interview. This should be part 3, I believe. Let's go ahead and jump right into this. Playboy. Whom do you mean by the establishment? King. I mean the white leadership, which I hold as responsible as anyone for the riots, for not removing the conditions that caused them. The deep frustration, the seething desperation of the Negro today is a product of slum housing, chronic poverty, woefully inadequate education, and substandard schools. The Negro is trapped in a long and desolate corridor with no exit sign, caught in a vicious socio-economic vice. And he is ostracized, as is no other minority group in America, by the evil of oppressive and constricting prejudice based solely upon his color. A righteous man has no alternative but to resist such an evil system. If he does not have the courage to resist nonviolently, then he runs the risk of a violent emotional explosion. As much as I deplore violence, there is one evil that is worse than violence, and that's cowardice. It is still my basic article of faith that social justice can be achieved and democracy advanced only to the degree that there is firm adherence to nonviolent action and resistance to the pursuit of social justice. But America will be faced with the ever present threat of violence, rioting, and senseless crime as long as Negroes, by the hundreds of thousands, are packed into malodorous, rat plagued ghettos, as long as Negroes remain smothered by poverty in the midst of an affluent society, as long as Negroes see their freedom endlessly delayed and diminished by the headwinds of tokenism and small handouts from the white power structure. No nation can suffer any greater tragedy than to cause millions of its citizens to feel that they have no stake in their own society. Understand that I am trying only to explain the reasons for violence and the threat of violence. Let me say again that by no means and under no circumstances do I condone outbreaks of looting and lawlessness. I feel that every responsible Negro leader must point out with all possible vigor that anyone who perpetrates and participates in a riot is immoral as well as impractical, and the use of immoral means will not achieve the moral end of racial justice. Playboy. Whom do you consider the most responsible Negro leaders? King. Well, I would say that Roy Wilkins of the NAACP has proved time and again to be a very articulate spokesman for the rights of Negroes. He is a most able administrator and a dedicated organization man with personal resources that have helped the whole struggle. Another outstanding man is Whitney Young Jr. of the National Urban League, an extremely able social scientist. He has developed a meaningful balance between militancy and moderation. James Farmer of CORE is another courageous, dedicated, and thoughtful civil rights spokesman. I have always been impressed by how he maintains a freshness in his awareness of the meaning of the whole quest for freedom. And John Lewis of SNCC symbolizes the kind of strong militancy, courage, and creativity that our youth have brought to the civil rights struggle. But I feel that the greatest leader of these times that the Negro has produced is A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, whose total integrity, depth, and dedication and caliber of statesmanship set an example for all of us. Playboy. Many whites feel that last summer's riots occurred because leadership is no longer being offered by the men you named. King. The riots we have had are minute compared to what would have happened without their effective and restraining leadership. I am convinced that unless the nonviolent philosophy had emerged and taken hold among Negroes, North and South, by today the streets of dozens of American communities would have flowed with blood. Hundreds of cities might now be mourning countless dead of both races were it not for the nonviolent influence which has given political surgeons the time and opportunity to boldly and safely excise some of the aspects of the peril of violence that faced this nation in the summers of 1963 and 64. The whole world has seen what happened in the communities such as Harlem, Brooklyn, Rochester, Philadelphia, Newark, St. Petersburg, and Birmingham, where the emergency operation was either botched or not performed at all. Playboy. Still, doesn't the very fact that riots occurred tend to indicate that many Negroes are no longer heeding the counsels of nonviolence? King. Not the majority by any means, but if it is true that some Negroes subscribe to a deep feeling that the tactic of nonviolence is not producing enough concrete victories. We have seen in our experience that nonviolence thrives best in a climate of justice. Violence grows to the degree that injustice prevails. The more injustice is a given community in a given community, the more violence or potential violence smolders in that community. I can give you a clear example if you will notice. There has been fewer riots in the South. The reason for this is that the Negro in the South can see some visible concrete victories in civil rights. Last year, the police would have been called if he sat down at a community lunch counter. This year, if he chooses to sit at that counter, he is served. More riots have occurred in the North because the fellow in Harlem, to name one northern ghetto, can't see any victories. He remains throttled. as he has always been, by vague, intangible economic and social deprivations, until the concerned power structures begin to grapple creatively with these fundamental inequities. It will be difficult for violence to be eliminated. The longer our people see no progress or halting progress, the easier it'll be for them to yield to the counsels of hatred and demagoguery. Playboy. The literature of the John Birch Society, accusing you of such counsels, has branded you a conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. King. As you know, they have sought to link many people with communism, including the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a former President of the United States. So I'm in good company, at least. The Birchers thrive on sneer and smear and the dissemination of half truths and outright lies. It would be comfortable to dismiss them as the lunatic fringe, which by and large they are. But some priests and ministers have also shown themselves to be among them. They are a very dangerous group, and they could become even more dangerous if the public doesn't reject the un American travesty of patriotism that they espouse. Playboy. Was there any basis, in fact, for the rumors still circulating in some quarters that last summer's riots were fomented by and stage directed by communist agitators? King. I'm getting sick and tired of people saying that this movement has been infiltrated by communists. There are so many communists in this freedom movement as there are Eskimos in Florida. The FBI provided the best answer to this absurd rumor in its report to the president after a special investigation which he had requested. It stated that the riots were not caused or directed by any such groups, although they did try to capitalize upon and prolong the riots. All Negro leaders, including myself, were most happy with the publication of these findings, for the public whimperings had troubled us. We knew that it could prove vitally harmful to the Negro struggle if the riots had been catalyzed or manipulated by the communists or some other extremist group. It would have been seen it would have sown the seed of doubt in the public's mind that the Negro Revolution is a genuine revolution, born from the same womb that produces all massive social upheavals, the womb of intolerable conditions and unendurable situations. Playboy. Is it destined to be a violent revolution? King. God willing, no. But white Americans must be made to understand that the basic motives underlying Negro demonstrations. Many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations are boiling inside the Negro and must release themselves. It is not a threat, but a fact of history that if an oppressed people's pent-up emotions are not non-violently released, they will be violently released. So let the Negro march. Let him make pilgrimages to City Hall. Let him go on freedom rides, and above all, make it an effort to understand why he must do this. For if his frustration and despair are allowed to continue piling up, millions of Negroes will seek solace and security in black nationalist ideologies. And this inevitably would lead to a frightening social nightmare. Playboy. Among whites, the best known and most feared of these militantly racist Negro sects is the Black Muslims. What is your estimation of its power and influence among the Negro masses? King. Except for a few metropolitan ghettos, my experience has been that few Negroes have any interest at all in this organization, much less give any allegiance to its pessimistic doctrines. The Black Muslims are a quasi religious socio political movement that has appealed to some Negroes who formerly were Christians. But for the first time, the Negro was presented with a choice of a religion rather than Christianity. What this appeal actually represented was an indictment of Christian failures to live up to Christianity's precepts. For there is nothing in Christianity nor in the Bible that justifies racial segregation. But when the Negro's genuine fighting spirit rose during 1963, the appeal of the Muslims began to diminish. Playboy. One of the basic precepts of black nationalism has been the attempt to engender a sense of communion between the American Negro and his African brother, a sense of identity between the emergence of Black Africa and the Negro struggle for freedom in America. Do you feel that this is a constructive effort? King. Yes, I do in many ways. There is a distinct, significant, and inevitable correlation. The Negro across America, looking at his television set, sees black statesmen voting in the United Nations and vital world issues, knowing that in many of America's cities, he himself is not yet permitted to um, place his ballot. The Negro hears of black kings and potentates ruling in palaces where he remains ghettoized in urban slums. It is only natural that Negroes would react to this extreme irony. Consciously or unconsciously, the American Negro has been caught up by the black zeitgeist. He feels a deepening sense of identification with his black African brothers and with his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean. With them, he is moving with a sense of increasing urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. Playboy. Do you feel that the African nations in turn should involve themselves more actively in American Negro affairs? King. I do indeed. The world is now so small in terms of geographic proximity and mutual problems that no nation should stand idly by and watch another's plight. I think that in every possible instance, Africans should use the influence of their governments to make it clear that the struggle of their brothers in the U.S. is part of a worldwide struggle. In short, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, for we are tied together in a garment of mutuality. What happens in Johannesburg affects Birmingham, however indirectly. We are descendants of the Africans. Our heritage is Africa. We should never seek to break the ties, nor should the Africans. Playboy, one of the most articulate champions of Black African Afro American brotherhood, has been Malcolm X, the former Black Muslim leader who recently renounced his racist past and converted to Orthodox Mohammedanism. What is your opinion of him and his career? King, I met Malcolm X once in Washington, but circumstances didn't enable me to talk to him or to talk with him for more than a minute. He is very articulate, as you say, but I totally disagree with many of his political and philosophical views, at least insofar as I understand where he now stands. I don't want to seem to sound self righteous or absolutist, or that I think I have the only truth, the only way. Maybe he does have some of the answers. I don't know how he feels now, but I know that I have often wished that we would talk less of violence because violence is not going to solve our problems. And in his litany of articulating the despair of the Negro without offering any positive, creative alternative, I feel that Malcolm has done himself and our people a great disservice. Fiery demagogic oratory in the black ghettos, urging Negroes to arm themselves and prepare to engage in violence as he has done, can reap nothing but grief. Playboy, for them or for whites? King, for everyone, but mostly for them. For the extremist leaders who preach revolution are invariably unwilling to lead what they know would certainly end in bloody, chaotic, and total defeat. For in the event of a violent revolution, we would be sorely outnumbered, and when it was all over, we would the Negro would face the same unchanged conditions, the same squalor and deprivation. The only difference being that his bitterness would be even more intense, his disenchantment even more abject. Thus, in purely practical and as well as moral terms, the American Negro has no rational alternative to nonviolence. Playboy. Then categorically reject violence as a tactical technique for social change. Can it not be argued, however, that violence historically has affected massive and sometimes constructive social change in some countries? King, I'd be the first to say that some historical victories have been won by violence. The U.S. Revolution is certainly one of the foremost. But the Negro Revolution is seeking integration, not independence. Those fighting for independence have the purpose to drive out the oppressors. But here in America, we've got to live together. We've got to find a way to reconcile ourselves to living in community, one group with the other. The struggle of the Negro in America to be successful must be waged with resolute efforts, but efforts that are kept strictly within the framework of our democratic society. This means reaching, educating, and moving large enough groups of people of both races to stir the conscience of the nation. Playboy, how do you propose to go about it? King, before we can make any progress, we must avoid retrogression by doing everything in our power to avert further racial violence. To this end, there are three immediate steps that I would recommend. First, it is mandatory that people of good will across America, particularly those who are in positions to wield influence and power, conduct honest, soul searching analyses and evaluations of the environmental causes causes that spawn riots. All major industrial and ghetto areas should establish serious biracial discussions of community problems and of ways to begin solving them instead of ambulance service. Municipal leaders need to provide preventative medicine. Secondly, these communities should make serious efforts to provide work and training for unemployed youth, though job and training programs such as the HARU Act program in New York City. Thirdly, all cities concerned should make first priority efforts to provide immediate quality education for Negro youth instead of conducting studies for the next 5 years. Young boys and girls now in the ghettos must be enabled to feel that they count, that somebody cares about them, that they must be able to feel hope. And on a longer range basis, the physical ghetto itself must be eliminated because these are environmental conditions that germinate riots. It is both socially and morally suicidal to continue a pattern of deploring effects while failing to come to grips with the causes. Ultimately, law and order will be maintained only when justice and dignity are accorded impartiality to all. Playboy. Along with the other civil rights leaders, you have often proposed a massive program of economic aid financed by the federal government to improve the lot of the nation's 20 million Negroes. Just one of the projects you mentioned, however, the HARU Act program to provide jobs for Negro youth, is expected to cost $141 million over the next 10 years. And that includes only Harlem. A nationwide program, such as you propose, would undoubtedly run into the billions. King, about 50 billion actually, which is less than 1 year of our present defense spending. It is my belief that with the expenditure of this amount over a 10-year period, a genuine and dramatic transformation could be achieved in the conditions of Negro life in America. I am positive, moreover, that the money spent would be more than amply justified by the benefits that would accrue to the nation through a spectacular decline in school dropouts, family breakups, crime rates, illegitimacy, swollen relief rolls, rioting, and other social evils. Playboy, do you think it's realistic to hope that the government would consider an appropriation of such magnitude other than for national defense? King, I certainly do. This country has the resources to solve any problem once the problem is accepted as national policy. An example is aid to Appalachia, which has been made a policy of the federal government's much touted war on poverty. 1 billion has was proposed for its relief without making the slightest dent in the defense budget. Another example is the fact that after World War II, during the years when it became policy to build and maintain the largest military machine in the world has ever known, America also took upon itself, through the Marshall Plan and other measures, the financial relief and rehabilitation of millions of European people. If America can afford to underwrite its allies and ex enemies, it can certainly afford and has a much greater obligation, as I see it, to do at least as well by its own no less needy countrymen. Playboy, do you feel it's fair to request a multi-million-dollar program of preferential treatment for the Negro or for any other minority group? King, I do indeed. Can any fair minded citizen deny that the Negro has been deprived? Few people reflect that for 2 centuries the Negro was enslaved and robbed of any wages, potential accrued wealth, which would have been the legacy of his own descendants. All of America's wealth today could not adequately compensate its Negroes for his centuries of exploitation and humiliation. It is an economic fact that a program such as I propose would certainly cost far less than any computation of 2 centuries of unpaid Negro plus accumulated interest. In any case, I do not intend that this program of economic aid should apply only to the Negro. It should benefit the disadvantaged of all races. Within common law, we have ample precedents for special compens- compensatory programs which are regarded as settlements. American Indians are still being paid for land in the settlement manner. Is not 2 centuries of labor which helped to build this country as a real real a commodity? Many other easily approachable precedents are readily at hand. Our child labor laws, Social Security, unemployment compensation, manpower restraining programs, retraining programs. And you will remember that America adopted a policy of special treatment for her millions of veterans after the war, a program which cost far more than a policy of preferential treatment to rehabilitate the traditionally disadvantaged Negro would cost today. The closest analogy is the GI Bill of Rights. Negro rehabilitation in America would require approximately the same breadth of program, which would not place an undue burden on our economy, just as was the case with the returning soldier. Such a bill for the disadvantaged and impoverished would enable them to buy homes without cash, at lower and easier repayment terms. They could negotiate loans from banks to launch businesses. They could receive, as did XGI, special points to place them ahead in competition for several service jobs. Under certain circumstances of physical disability, medical care, and long term financial grants could be made available. And together with these rights, a favorable social climate could be created to encourage the preferential employment of the disadvantaged, who, as was the case for so many years with the veterans. During those years, it might be noted, there was no appreciable resentment of the preferential treatment being given to the special group. America was only compensating her veterans for their time lost from school or from business. Playboy. If a nationwide program of preferential deployment for Negroes were to be adopted, how would you propose to assuage the resentment of whites who already feel that their jobs are being jeopardized by the influx of Negroes resulting from desegregation? King, we must develop a federal program of public works retraining and jobs for all, so that none, white or black, will have cause to feel threatened. At the present time, thousands of jobs a week are disappearing in the wake of automation and other production efficiency techniques. Black and white, we will all be harmed unless something grand and imaginative is done. The unemployed, poverty stricken white man must be made to realize that he is in the very same boat with the Negro. Together, they could exert massive pressure on the government to get jobs for all. Together, they could form a grand alliance. Together, they could they could merge all people for the good of for all. Playboy. If Negroes are also granted preferential treatment in housing, as you propose, how would you allay the alarm with which many white homeowners, fearing property devaluation, greet the arrival of Negroes in hitherto all white neighborhoods? King, we must expunge from our society the myths and half truths that engender such groundless fears as these. In the first place, there is no truth to the myth that Negroes depreciate property. The fact is that most Negroes are kept out of residential neighborhoods so long that when one of us is financially sold a home, it's already depreciated. In the second place, we must dispel the negative and harmful atmosphere that has been created by avaricious and unprincipled realtors who engage in blockbusting. If we had in America really serious efforts to break down the discrimination in housing and at the same time a concerted program of government aid to improve housing for Negroes, I think that many white people would be surprised at how many Negroes would choose to live among themselves, exactly as Poles and Jews and other ethnic groups do. Playboy, the B'nai B'rith, a prominent social action organization which undertakes on behalf of the Jewish people many of the activities that you ask the government to perform for Negroes is generally financed by Jewish charities and private donations. All of the Negro civil rights groups, on the other hand, including your own, are personally in financial straits and must rely heavily on white philanthropy in order to remain solvent. Why do they receive so little support from Negroes? King. We have to face and live with the fact that the Negro has not developed a sense of stewardship. Slavery was so divisive and brutal, so molded to break up unity, that we never developed a sense of oneness, as in Judaism. Starting with the individual family unit, the Jewish people are closely knit into what is, in effect, one big family. But with the Negroes, slavery separated families from families. And the pattern of disunity that we see among Negroes today derives directly from this cruel fact of history. It is also a cruel fact that the Negro, generally speaking, has not developed a responsible sense of financial values. The best economists say that your automobile shouldn't cost more than half of your annual income, but we see many Negroes earning $7,000 a year paying $5,000 for a car. The home, it is said, should not cost more than twice the annual income. But we see many Negroes earning, say, $8,000 a year, living in a $30,000 home. Negroes who amount to about 11% of the American population are reported to consume over 40% of the Scotch whiskey imported into the U.S. and to spend over $72 million a year in jewelry stores. So when we come asking for civil rights donations or help for the United Negro College Fund, most Negroes are trying to make ends meet. Playboy. The widespread voting or looting that took place during last summer's riots would seem to prove your point. Do you agree that those who feel that this looting, much of which was directed against Jewish owned stores, was anti Semitic in motivation? King. No, do not believe that the riots could in any way be considered expressions of anti Semitism. It's true, as I was particularly pained to learn, that a large percentage of the looted stores were owned by our Jewish friends, but I do not feel that anti Semitism was involved. A high percentage of the merchants serving most Negro communities simply happened to be Jewish. How could there be anti Semitism among Negroes when our Jewish friends have demonstrated their commitment to the principle of tolerance and brotherhood, not only in the form of sizable contributions, but in many other tangible ways, and often at great personal sacrifice? Can we ever express our appreciation to the rabbis who choose who chose to give moral witness with us in St. Augustine during our recent protest against segregation in that unhappy city? Need I remind anyone of the awful beating suffered by Rabbi Arthur Lelevild of Cleveland when he joined the civil rights workers here in Harrisburg, Mississippi. And who can ever forget the sacrifice of two Jewish lives, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, in the swamps of Mississippi? It would be impossible to record the contribution of the Jewish people have made toward the Negro struggle for freedom. It has been so great. We'll go ahead and end the reading there. We've still got enough, I think, for about one more piece. But yeah, Dr. King, again, saying he doesn't condone looting or rioting. He understands it. And he makes the point that it shouldn't be white versus black. Because unfortunately, automation will replace them, which is something we're seeing more and more of today. But this was back in 1960. I forgot what year they said the interview was, but yeah. So they could see it coming. But yeah. But as always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.